up to now, our focus has largely been backward-looking, and panel 4, this panel will change that. The panel is titled Blockchain-Backed Cryptocurrencies, Order Without Law in the Digital Age. And here to introduce and moderate this panel from the United States Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit, Judge John B. Nalbandian.
Thank you, Lad. I appreciate that. And thank you, everybody. I want to welcome everyone to what I think is going to be an interesting panel on a cutting-edge topic. But before we begin, of course, I want to thank the Federalist Society for having us here, and also the Arizona State Sandra Day O'Connor School of Law and the ASU Federalist Society Student Chapter. I've had an opportunity to spend some time at the law school this semester back in January and now, and I've had a great time interacting with the students and the faculty here. So thank you all. I was thinking, by the way, this morning that 25 years ago, I was a third-year law student at UVA, and we hosted this conference. So I have an idea of some of the work that you have to put in to host it. And here I am now moderating a panel 25 years later, so how cool is that, right? So our panel is on blockchain-backed cryptocurrency, and specifically questions about the likelihood that cryptocurrencies are going to play a meaningful role in the global economy moving forward, and the question of regulation of cryptocurrency. And I think the possibility, given the title of the panel, or perhaps the reality right now, that we can have order without law in this space. That latter thought is a prospect, honestly, that makes me a little bit wary, given that my job right now seems to depend on order with law. And it's certainly a prospect that should be of great interest to all of you as aspiring lawyers. I do have to confess that my own knowledge in this area is limited only to my sometimes obsessive checking of my Coinbase account, and what has become for me a rags to riches and back to rags story. Indeed, when I first agreed to moderate this panel, I wondered whether, given the recent trajectory of my rather modest cryptocurrency investment, whether it would actually be a requiem on the short history of cryptocurrency. But today, we've, I think, reached a little bit of stability in 2019, maybe as much stability as we can expect in a rapidly changing market, and hopefully our panelists can have something to say about that. Anyway, suffice it to say, the experts on cryptocurrency, its future, and its possible regulation are here on this panel, so let's meet them, and as always, my relatively short introduction is not indicative at all of their very impressive accomplishments. So first up, we're going to have Mr. Jim Harper, who was most recently Executive Vice President at the Competitive Enterprise Institute. Previously, Mr. Harper was Senior Fellow at the Cato Institute, and in addition to having served as counsel to committees in both the U.S. House and the U.S. Senate, he's also represented various companies such as PayPal, Digital Globe, and VeriSign. And in 2014, he served as Global Policy Counsel for the Bitcoin Foundation. Next up, we'll have a very familiar face to the Federalist Society, Professor John Mcginnis, who is a George C. Dix Professor in Constitutional Law at the Northwestern Pritzker School of Law. He previously served as a Deputy Assistant Attorney General in the Office of Legal Counsel, and he is the author of 2 books, including one excellent book that I recommend on originalism called Originalism and the Good Constitution. He's written numerous articles, obviously, including very recent articles and publications on cryptocurrency, and so we look forward to hearing from him. Next up, we have the Honorable Mary Beth Buchanan, who currently serves as General Counsel for Kraken Cryptocurrency Exchange. She was previously a partner at Bryan Cave, where she focused on white-collar criminal defense. And before that, she served as a United States Attorney for the Western District of Pennsylvania from September of 2001 to 2009. And last up, we have Professor Gary Marchant, who is a Regents Professor of Law and director of the Center for Law, Science, and Innovation here at Arizona State. He's got a variety of research interests, including things that I have no idea what they are, so I won't go into them. But he was named a Regents Professor in 2011. He is also a professor at ASU's School of Life Sciences, and prior to joining ASU, he was a partner at the Washington, D.C. office of Kirkland & Ellis. So please join me in welcoming our panelists, and we're going to start with Mr. Harper.
Thank you, Judge Nalbandian. Your introduction inspired me to check how we're doing today, and we're doing okay. That might change over the next hour.
Yeah, we've been
But congratulations to the Federalist Society for the great success you've had over years, and congratulations to all of you who are attending, because you have a very important role in developing the legal thinking across society in ways that are good for us. I have a 25-year reference myself. I graduated from law school 25 years ago, and at Hastings in San Francisco, the Federalist Society was one quirky guy. It wasn't me, but he had some sensible things to say. It was a time of political correctness, and in a city like San Francisco, it probably wasn't easy to be the Federalist Society guy. But the organization and all of you are doing great work. Any of you who feel alone on your campuses, coming here I think probably helps you understand that there's a community around you who are supportive and who are doing really excellent thinking and work in the law. I was with the Bitcoin Foundation in 2014 and was its Global Policy Council, and sort of had a role trying to educate members of Congress and educate Brussels about Bitcoin. And I spoke up too much on our planning call, so I was assigned to tell some of you to sort of try to articulate what Bitcoin is and how it works really quickly before I make a few brief remarks on the topic. And I'll try to hit two major highlights. One is the technology. I'm not a technologist myself, so this is the dumbed down version that I tried to use on members of Congress and their staff. And it's to think in terms of analogy. We all understand what email is, right? And one of the reasons is because it's named email. We understand it's sort of an electronic version of this old thing, postal mail. Well, Bitcoin and blockchain don't have that advantage. The words are a little obscure. But Bitcoin, the software, is essentially a ledger technology. It's a ledger system that allows a peer-to-peer global network to maintain a ledger independent of any organization. And just like email took the post office out of the role of transferring your most important communications, of course it continues to exist, but that's a topic for another day. But email is essentially peer-to-peer. When I send an email, it goes directly to the person rather than through the post office. The Bitcoin or blockchain e-ledger technology allows the ledger to be maintained without any central processor, without any central controller. That means there's no corporation to commit various hijinks. That means there's no government to take hold of the corporation or to do anything. So it's this ledger system that is global and without any sort of central control. Lots and lots of services and lots of intellectual infrastructure, if you will, in society are essentially ledgers. What is PayPal but a ledger system? Now, PayPal doesn't take $20 out of one box and put it in another box with my name and your name on it when I send you $20 on PayPal. Rather, they make a notation in a ledger that the $20 formerly with Jim is now with you. So PayPal's a ledger system. Most of your bank is essentially a ledger keeper. And so the optimized use of the Bitcoin blockchain is for keeping track of the transfer of assets. So it's a ledger system. Ledgers can be applied elsewhere, and there's talk of using blockchain to keep track of identity. Again, we think that our identity comes from the Department of Motor Vehicles in our state government. Well, our identity is actually quite a bit more complex and interesting than that. And maybe we should be able to identify ourselves reliably without relying on a government agency to do it for us. Also, things like property recordation. I think counties and localities do a pretty good job of it, but in a lot of countries in the world, they don't do a very good job of it, or they do no job of it at all. So having property recordation on a blockchain would give a lot of people access to control over their property and allow them the kind of financial and economic uplift that Hernando de Soto likes to tout so much. So that's an idea of the Bitcoin blockchain. It's this technology for a ledger. It's an append-only database that anybody can write to. And if it's all going well, nobody can change and nobody can erase. So you've all got it. You can pass the quiz at the end of the session. Now let's talk about Bitcoin, the item of value. To understand Bitcoin as an item of value, you have to understand a little wee bit of economics, and the latest, greatest theory in economics is the subjective theory of value. That is, the thing that makes a thing valuable is people's agreement on its value. I want something, I value it, I will expend this much money or this much effort to get it. The reason why anything has value is because of your own opinions and the shared opinions of others that they are valuable. There's no such thing on this earth as intrinsic value. And I see solid economists talk about intrinsic value. But I'll put that economist on a desert island with a bar of gold, and they'll be in lots and lots of trouble because that bar of gold is worthless on a deserted island. What they need is a banana or a sandwich. The value of things is all relative, it's all subjective, it's all dependent on what's going on around you. Over the history of time, people have treated a lot of different things as money, as items of value. Salt, cowrie shells, cattle, cigarettes. There are even tribes where rectangles of paper about this size are treated as valuable and traded among the natives. Well, just like you can value rectangles of paper, you can value the authority to make a notation in a database. And that's essentially what you're valuing, though the Bitcoin uses the coin metaphor in order to make it more easy to access for us mentally. It's a rare thing, it's a scarce thing, and it's a thing that you can trade very, very nicely over the internet. It's the first example of cash that you can directly transfer over the internet, or digital gold if you prefer. So that's essentially the money side of things. And understanding the money, I think you have to start with a subjective theory of value. So yeah, we have on the panel so far, we've been talking about sort of the battle for economic liberty as a legal matter. What Bitcoin and other blockchain iterations offer, I think, is economic liberty as a technical matter. It's not asking for liberty or fighting for liberty, it's just taking it. Because you can do things, ideally, on a well-constructed blockchain, a well-operated blockchain, that terrestrial governments don't have access to. There literally isn't, when a blockchain or a coin are well-run and when people are using it intelligently, there isn't a terrestrial jurisdiction that can get a hold of it. Nobody can regulate the blockchain because it's global and its operators are everywhere and nowhere at all. Ideally, nobody can control a cryptocurrency because it's global, open source software. There's actually nothing for a government to grab, to get a hold of, to take jurisdiction over. When I was with the Bitcoin Foundation, this is 2014, so it's now 5 years ago, and Bitcoin was kind of the only thing going, life was a lot simpler then. We were thinking a lot about this, and we were thinking about how Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies could be used with at least the same protections you got from law, but without the availability of law. Because anybody programming a financial service could be anywhere. You could have financial services provided by software, the authors of which you did not know, and the authors of which were not in the same country as you. So what were we going to do? It was going to be hard, but also Bitcoin and cryptocurrency offer potentially better consumer protections than the existing financial services system, particularly with respect to transparency. Financial services providers can essentially prove what reserves they have rather than requiring you to rely on them or them with government oversight. So there's a lot of opportunity there. Obviously, we would need a sort of cultural resurgence too of caveat emptor and personal responsibility. To close, I'll tell a little story about some work we did at the Bitcoin Foundation on this idea of consumer protections as good as law would provide, but fully based on market activity. We went to try and figure out what financial consumer protection was like, and we initiated a little tiny project that I called a blue sky analysis of financial consumer protections. Ironically, blue sky is a name for a set of like securities regulations at the state level. I didn't know that at the time, so it was kind of a foolish name for this project. But the idea was to take just a fresh look at what consumer protection in the financial services space was. And I won't summarize that for you, but we put this together at a law firm in DC. Before too long, the bottom was falling out of the Bitcoin price at the time. Ironically, for a foundation created to advance a new form of money, the Bitcoin Foundation ran out of money, and we rolled up shop. They didn't pay the legal bills that we had incurred in putting together this blue sky analysis of financial protection, and the law firm ended up shopping this material around as a blueprint for new state legislative regulation of Bitcoin and cryptocurrency. So I think that maybe tees up for some of the topics we'll have on the next panel, but the effort to have order without law has not materialized yet, but I think there's a great deal of possibility in Bitcoin and blockchain. Thanks.
When I became a member of the small band that was the Federalist Society 37 years ago, it would have been impossible to imagine discussing the subject of cryptocurrency as part of its proceedings, let alone before such a substantial crowd. But ultimately, the society and the Constitution that it celebrates are concerned with the relationship of the liberty and the state. And there's no issue of modern technology more appropriate for us to consider, because cryptocurrency is on the cutting edge of the divide between liberty and the state, between a centralized coercive order and a decentralized voluntary one. And that divide here comes in the most important, that most important matter of money. Modern fiat currency, like the dollars in your pocket and bank accounts, is quintessentially a creature of the state. In 1924, George Frederick Knapp, the father of modern monetary theory, wrote, "The soul of currency is not in the material of the pieces, but in the legal ordinances which regulate their use." Knapp argued that currency must be constituted by law, since only governments can confer the requisite legitimacy to gain acceptance and public trust. Thus, the underlying value of a currency is intrinsically tied to a public's trust in that legal system. Yet, of course, some citizens have little trust in their legal system, particularly when it comes to currency. Nation-states can manipulate their currency, printing more money to fund projects for their favored supporters. Savings then lose their value as prices are driven up by inflation. Citizens become less certain of money as a store of value, and economic growth suffers. Government control over money thus can be a form of oppression no less than the denial of civil liberties. Because, for instance, of its hyperinflation today, Venezuela is but the most extreme example of what I would call a monetarily oppressive regime. The recent advent of cryptocurrencies, Bitcoin chief among them, poses both a practical challenge to such monetarily oppressive regimes and a theoretical challenge to the view that the public law of currency is the necessary foundation of money. Thus, although the creation of Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies is as impressive as a technological innovation, Bitcoin's central innovation is in trust, the essential characteristic of any currency that will have long-term success. Bitcoin does not require faith in any public institution, such as the Federal Reserve, a monarch, or any other central authority, but rather trust in the computer logic and the effectiveness of the decentralized order that maintains it, as Mr. Harper has described. Thus, Bitcoin is nothing less than a fundamental assault on the idea that a public law of currency is a necessary prerequisite of the modern monetary order. In fact, Bitcoin has the potential to outperform the currencies produced by legal regimes as a store of value, precisely because it requires no trust in political process, but rather trust in a transparent set of rules and transactions that follow those rules. The basic problem for public or fiat currencies is that a legal system cannot generally make the pre-commitments necessary to completely isolate the governance of its money supply from all political pressure. Bluntly, no one can insulate the stability claimed by public law from the hurly-burly of politics. To be sure, the US dollar is the world's most trusted currency. Despite its many critics, the dollar has formed the basis for 90% of international trade over the past 30 years, because companies, consumers, and central banks around the world trust in the relative stability of the Federal Reserve and the US government. Yet the dollar has been subject to periods of severe and unexpected inflation. In fact, since the creation of the Federal Reserve, the purchasing power of the dollar has fallen by 97%. And that's not a surprise. Since the progressive era, the Federal Reserve has had, by law, other political objectives than maintaining the value of the currency, such as, for instance, getting to full employment. But individuals only have one desire for a currency, that it maintain its value. The basic divergence between the social objectives of fiat money and the individual's objective of retaining value is what necessarily limits the trust that any fiat currency can enjoy. If Bitcoin succeeds as a currency, it will do so by climbing the rungs left open by the frailties of the public law of money. It has already gained strength and stability by competing successfully against monetarily oppressive regimes and performing payment functions for the poor that bank regulations have made difficult. Now, indeed, I want to disagree perhaps with the judge. Looked at for its whole history, it's been an enormous success. It has had a substantial volatility of late. But if you had been an investor early on, you could be a millionaire, indeed even a billionaire today. But it has the potential to, I think, to be even more competitive and climb other open rungs, because even the best currencies are subject to the political risks inbuilt into any public law of currency. Now, I want to be clear here. I say potential, because while Bitcoin is used as a currency in monetarily oppressive regimes, people in Venezuela are using it right now, it does not function as a currency in more established regimes. That, of course, does not mean that people don't hold it in the United States. Some do, but even most of those hold it only for small investments and use it to pay for a few items, some as a kind of hobby. The vast majority of us hold most of our investments in dollar-denominated assets and use cash to pay day-to-day expenses. For most people, Bitcoin is not yet a good enough store of value. It's simply too volatile compared to the dollar, and risk-averse people don't want to hold their cash or assets in a unit of account so volatile. So I thought I'd end by sketching what needs to happen for Bitcoin or possibly some other cryptocurrency to gain greater market share against more mature currencies and ultimately against the dollar itself. It needs to continue to gain in price to attract investors, but also to lessen volatility to attract people who would like to hold it for the general purposes of payment. For a cryptocurrency with a fixed supply like Bitcoin, these two forces may sometimes be in tension. For instance, although rampant speculation may drive up a currency's value, the inherent volatility that comes along with such upward swings can be destabilizing for a currency. But that might not be a fatal flaw. If Bitcoin comes to enjoy a steady growth in demand, it will be able to obtain an acceptable level of volatility while at the same time reaching a broader market. To be clear, to become more successful and widely used, it does not need to become less volatile and more accepted than the dollar. There are many less successful currencies against which it could compete, and it would gain much value simply by replacing or indeed complementing gold as the basic hedge against currency devaluation. I think there are two important conditions for this to happen. One is the easiest. There have to be monetarily oppressive currencies to give substantial impetus to the use of Bitcoin as a currency. I have to say, given the renewed enthusiasm about socialism throughout the world, I'm not at all concerned about the fulfillment of this condition. When socialists run out of other people's money, they print more of it for themselves. The second condition is more open-ended. There has to be continued strength in what I would call the Bitcoin ecosystem. Most people don't have the skills to use Bitcoin directly. There are amusing stories about people who've somehow lost their Bitcoin key and are looking around for it in some of their papers, and they've lost millions of dollars. They need it to keep in a Bitcoin wallet, and they need mechanisms, therefore, to be secure in dealing with Bitcoin. Thus, they need cryptocurrency wallets and exchanges, like the one for which Mrs. Mcginnis is general counsel. Fortunately, these institutions have gotten a lot more professional since the day that Mt. Gox lost $100 million worth of Bitcoin. Even more importantly, there needs to be continued growth in the markets around Bitcoin. Future and forward markets make the price discovery process for Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies more efficient and help dampen volatility. Permitting ETFs, permitting funds that invest in Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies will allow more people to hold it as part of their portfolio. That will also thicken the market and have a stabilizing effect. Now note that these wallets, future markets, and ETFs are not order without law. They are institutions regulated by our law and by our administrators. And indeed, the SEC recently rejected, in my view wrongly, the Winklevoss's twin application for an ETF that would have been devoted to Bitcoin. Thus, paradoxically, the success of Bitcoin may depend on the state's willingness to apply the neutral principles of its laws to an innovation that may itself turn out to be a competitor to one of the greatest powers of the state, its ability to print fiat money. And that, again, I think shows why cryptocurrency is directly in the Federalist Society's wheelhouse. Its success depends ultimately on the rule of law and the constitutional respect for a new form of property.
I was going to stay in my seat, but then I realized I couldn't remember what the colors were on this map, so I had to get up to look at it. Thank you. Well, I think that many of us on this panel agree more than we disagree. In fact, I think I agree with most of what Professor Mcginnis said, although when we had our planning call, I thought that we were going to have way more disputes than, as it turns out. You know, when we started the call, we couldn't agree on what cryptocurrency is, whether it's a currency, whether it isn't a currency. And so I thought that that's where I would start my talk, because most people really can't agree on what it is. And as you can see, throughout the world, many countries, call it different things. In fact, even in the United States, different states refer to it with different terms, different agencies refer to it, with different terms. Primarily, though, the two terms that you will hear most often, I think, are virtual currency, actually three, virtual currency, digital currency, or digital asset. And I actually like the term digital asset, because that's really what it is. Of course it is not a fiat currency because it is not backed by a central government. But that's what's great about it, because it is not backed by a central government. But it certainly is an asset, and it is an asset that you can hold. It is an asset that you can trade. It is an asset that you can spend. It is an asset that we hope is going to appreciate, and unfortunately, sometimes it depreciates. But fortunately, it is on the upswing, and we hope that it continues to go in that direction. As you can see, looking at this map of the world, all of the colors in green show places in the world where cryptocurrency is legal. So in all of these places where it's green, you can hold cryptocurrency, you can spend it, you can trade it. So it is legal in these places. It doesn't necessarily mean that there is regulation, but it means that it is legal and the government is not going to, come and try to confiscate it from you. Now, the place that you will see is most friendly to cryptocurrency is Europe. In fact, Europe is probably one of the largest markets for cryptocurrency. In the UK, for example, cryptocurrency is totally unregulated. In fact, in Europe as a whole, it's unregulated. In the UK, it's known as foreign currency. In Germany, they call it private money. But it is very well accepted in Europe. And in fact, banks are not hostile to cryptocurrency in Europe. And it is, there are probably per capita, a lot more people in Europe that are using cryptocurrency than anywhere else in the world. Does anyone know what percentage of people in the world know of anything about cryptocurrency? I'm going to get my water, but I want someone to take a guess.
2%. 7%.
All right, so I have 2%,
I heard 7 over there.
7, 70? Okay, the actual answer is 1. Okay, so what percentage of 1% actually own cryptocurrency?
10% of the 1%.
It is 1% of 1% that own cryptocurrency. But of the 1% of the 1%, these people are trading, now this is globally, 140 billion. So that's a lot of cryptocurrency. Now, some of this is being held, some of this is being traded, some of it is actually being spent. In my Upper West Side neighborhood, there's a restaurant that takes cryptocurrency. And if you want to get in the football pool at Kraken, you need to have Bitcoin. So I think, depending on different businesses, certain businesses take credit cards, certain take cash. And as the acceptance of cryptocurrency grows, I think that you will see more and more businesses taking it. And probably the reason that you don't see such a big acceptance is because the price is fluctuating. So for example, if the price is fluctuating and you're holding Bitcoin, you probably don't want to spend it to get a haircut. If you think that the price is going to go up, in the next week, you're going to want to hold it. So for that reason, you probably don't see people, spending quite as much. Looking at some of these other places in the world, Asia, there are some very large exchanges in Asia, but there are places in Asia where cryptocurrency is specifically prohibited. For example, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, and Cambodia. It's restricted in China and India, so a big portion of Asia, it is restricted. However, two of the most friendly markets in Asia, Singapore and Japan, have actually enacted comprehensive regulatory schemes for cryptocurrency. So in these places, they are so far ahead of the US in coming up with a comprehensive scheme for cryptocurrency. Latin America, of course, it is restricted in Bolivia and Ecuador. Venezuela, of course, has its own currency. It is illegal in certain Middle Eastern countries like Saudi Arabia and Algeria. And in others, like Abu Dhabi, they have their own regulatory scheme that they have recently enacted. So as we look to other places in the world, I think that you will see that countries are taking steps to really adopt cryptocurrency and to come up with regulation that makes sense. And in many of these countries, they actually work with the business community to find something that works. Unfortunately, in the US, our regulators haven't done that yet. And I think there's a couple of reasons for this. First, we have a couple different agencies that all want to claim jurisdiction. For example, the CFTC calls it a commodity. The SEC sometimes calls it a security. And of course, the IRS calls it property. So each of these agencies have a separate interest in cryptocurrency. And so each have to figure out what their role is going to be in regulating it. And so thus far, they haven't been able to get together and come up with a comprehensive scheme. In some of the other countries around the globe, they have one sort of financial regulator that basically comes up with the rules, and then they have separate components within that regulator that can handle different aspects of the use of cryptocurrency. So I think that this may be one instance where the US should maybe look to what other countries are doing and see whether we might be able to come up with a regulatory scheme that might make sense and learn from what some of the other countries are doing around the world.
Well, thank you for inviting me to be at this conference. It's always nice to go to a conference where you just have to walk down 2 flights of stairs from your office. It's a nice way to do it. And I want to thank, first of all, delighted to be on such a distinguished panel, but also want to thank our students here from our ASU Federalist Society for putting this on. It's a lot of work, particularly when they're in the middle of law school and courses and all that, so thank you for all the effort you put into this. So I got interested in blockchain and Bitcoin about 5 years ago when I was asked to give a talk at the end of a court here in town about Bitcoin. I knew nothing about it. The best way to learn something is to talk about it and expose your ignorance. And so I did what John talked about, and I lost my first Bitcoin. I figured I'd buy some Bitcoin to go talk about it at the end of the course. I spent $75, and at that point I got a third of a Bitcoin and wrote down this long number on a piece of paper. And so now every day I come to my office and I hope that this will be the day I find that piece of paper, because it started to get worth a lot of money for a while there. But there's something like a quarter of all Bitcoins have been lost, because unlike bank accounts and things like that, where there may be someone you can go and resurrect it, you can't with cryptocurrencies. That's one caution, is to make sure you store your private key very carefully. There's all kinds, as John was referring to, all kinds of online or offline tools you can do that now, not just writing on a piece of paper. But a lot of people, I think, do that, and it's in their estate. You know, estate lawyers have to be looking for these long codes now, because a lot of them, I think, are just getting thrown away, and no one knows what this is because the lawyers don't understand what that is, and that's gone forever. Anyhow, so I'm a little bit skeptical about cryptocurrencies. I think there's a role for them. I'm a huge fan of blockchain, and so let me sort of just explain some of my concerns. So one is alphabet super regulators that have jumped on to cryptocurrencies that Mary was talking about. I mean, that's really, I think, impeding a lot of the innovation and freedom that was going on in that space initially. There was some bad actors, but they're obviously a minority of them. And yes, we have to screen those out. But there's now so much regulatory activity. 4 different agencies all saying it's a different thing and all trying to get in on that it's really sort of, I think, squishing that whole space a little bit. There's other concerns. There's the way Bitcoins are created is basically through a process called mining, where people are basically solving these computer programs. And it used to be a law student on their computer could participate in that, but as you get fewer and fewer Bitcoins left, the amount of energy and activity and computing power you need goes up pretty substantially. And today all the mining is mostly occurring in China. There's a little bit here in North America, but most of it's in China, and it's using huge amounts of electricity. Some estimates are as much as the entire annual use of electricity for Hungary or Ireland. That, to me, is not a very sustainable pathway. And the problem is, for Bitcoin at least, it's just going to get worse, because Bitcoin's capped. There will never be more than 21 million coins ever issued. And I think we're at, 18 million now or something? So we're getting close to the end. And the way we validate these transactions is this mining, and you therefore have to give more and more reward as you get fewer and fewer Bitcoins left. And at some point when we cap out at 21 million, we'll have to not, and so the way these guys get paid right now is basically through new Bitcoins being created as part of the mining and the validation process. But once we get to the end of that, we will have to now pay an administrative cost out of our own transaction fees in order to fund this process to make this model continue. And that's going to be expensive, and it's going to take a lot of time for these transactions to clear. We already have a problem of basically phasing this up, where we basically scaling it up, that maybe I think there's something like 7 Bitcoin transactions a second compared to, I don't know how many hundreds of thousands of Visas or MasterCards. So it's already very limited. It's going to become even more limited going forward. Now, there's other models. Ethereum this year, which is another cryptocurrency, is going to switch from this mining process. It's called proof of work. They're are trying to switch this year to a proof of value work that may be more sustainable. They don't have a cap, so I'm not advocating for any particular cryptocurrencies. But if I look at it, I see, there's some problems with Bitcoin specifically that some other cryptocurrencies may not have. The other problem is hacking. So we just had the first real hack of a cryptocurrency The Mt. Goth and things like that are basically exchanges that are basically companies that aren't as responsible as Mary's, who are there to be the intermediary for you to get onto the blockchain. But when you get on the blockchain, it's been completely secure up until now. It's immutable. That's one of the strengths of it. But the problem is that when you get not enough mining power, because it's too small of a currency or people have gone away from it, you can do what's called the 50+1 hack. If you can get a bunch of bad people to get 50% of the computing power, they can basically steal all the money. And that's what just happened to a cryptocurrency called Ethereum Classic. And there's 1,500 or more of these cryptocurrencies out there. A lot of them are pretty small. And so if you put money into that, you're pretty vulnerable. It's not a problem with Bitcoin or Ethereum or these major currencies. But for these smaller ones that are out there, they're sort of sitting ducks if people want to go and try and hack them. So I think there are these problems with cryptocurrencies. I think there is a role for them in the future. I think we want to think about what is the business model and the technology model for a successful cryptocurrency, and there's a lot of experimentation going on, notwithstanding all the heavy regulatory pressures. But to me, the real exciting thing about this technology, I now teach a course, Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies and blockchain, is the blockchain itself. The proposal for Bitcoin was brilliant, not just for Bitcoin, but it basically created this whole idea of a blockchain that now has so many other applications that I think are the real future of this technology. It's now being used for all kinds of things. IBM and Walmart are using its supply chain for field greens and so on to basically make sure there's no contamination. And if there is contamination, we don't have to all throw away our romaine lettuces. We'll know exactly which bags came from the place with the contamination. And we'll be able to greatly limit the damage whenever you have any kind of food poisoning event. It's being used in all kinds of supply chain things. It's being used in energy now with some interesting ways, in real estate, in voting. Last election, West Virginia used this for military personnel overseas to be able to vote using a blockchain because of how hard it is to get them ballots. So it's being used in medical. We're having a meeting in this room, in this building, this Wednesday on real companies using blockchain very effectively and efficiently in medical practice here in Arizona. And that's happening all across the country of dozens of important applications in the medical context. The Harvard Medical School is putting all their doctor appointments on a blockchain to help them keep track of things and protect themselves on malpractice liability. So we're getting more and more of these different applications. With law firms, there's great stories of law firms using these for very efficient things and being able to do things. We had a meeting here in November on courts with the National Center for State Courts on the ways courts are now using these and some of the issues in using this in courts. So to me, that's the real future of this technology. The cryptocurrencies will have a role, but I think they'll be eclipsed by all these other innovative, creative ways of using this basic technology for all kinds of different industry sectors and so on. So that's what I'm really excited about. Let me just say one little thing in addition is the role of states. So a lot of states are playing a productive role in this technology. You know, it was interesting when we first got cryptocurrencies and Bitcoin, the first state to step in was New York, which came down with these really heavy regulations, and fortunately not a lot of states followed them. But what's happening since is states are realizing this is a source of innovation, of entrepreneurship, and so on. We in Arizona have been one of the leaders on this. We have the first regulatory sandbox, and a number of other bills have passed. Wyoming's gone way over, on this. They have something like 14 bills, all trying to promote using this technology, give people freedom to use it, to experiment, and so on. And a number of other states, Vermont even, for example, has a number of laws to try to promote and use this technology. So a lot of states are getting in on this, seeing this as an important technology for the future, and trying to encourage sort of this permissionless innovation, which is what really succeeded with the internet, and trying to allow innovators and entrepreneurs to try out different business models and new ideas. Now, of course, the limit on that is these federal rules that still apply even if you're in a state. David Schweikert is a congressperson from Arizona here, and he co-chairs a congressional blockchain group. He has talked about, I don't think he's had any success yet, of trying to allow the federal government to allow these state innovation projects and experiments to go forward without the heavy-handed of federal regulation, but we don't have that yet. But that would be a really interesting thing to see because there's a lot of potential here. Thanks.
Can we, actually, let's give the panelists a chance. Jim, do you want to comment on, and maybe you can address, one thing I think Gary was talking about, the blockchain technology as opposed to the Bitcoin. And maybe you can talk a little bit about what he means by the technology. And
Yeah, sure.
I mean, is that the ledger? Is that connected with the decentralized ledger idea?
Absolutely. The ledger, so I skipped over to try to be brief. I skipped over the details of blockchain, but that's the essence of the ledger. Transactions, whatever it is you're trying to collect, in the case of Bitcoin, it's transactions, are compiled by what's called miners. They're first broadcast by people who are engaging in transactions to this peer-to-peer network, and the peer-to-peer network passes them around, and a group of actors called miners collect them, and from time to time, on average in Bitcoin about every 10 minutes, they compile them all together and create a hash of all the transactions in that, and a little bit of other information in that collection of recent transactions, and they publish it to others as a block, a new block in the blockchain. The blockchain is a ledger. The block is a new ledger page. Using cryptography, it's tied to the previous page, and every page is tied to the page before it. So you could never go and change a page in the middle of the ledger, because then all the calculations that validate all the pages that follow would be broken. So that's how the blockchain works to create this sort of immutable record of things. The blockchain data structure, as distinct from full-blown crypto with a cryptocurrency like Bitcoin involved, I agree is a useful and interesting data structure by itself. The Bitcoin or crypto purist would poo-poo this, because why? It's just a database. You could use a SQL database, you could use any other database. But I think blockchain has a great deal of potential, and I'm actually writing a paper right now for the Data Foundation on how blockchain is useful for open data projects. You can bring a large circle of actors into a project. There's a good article by a writer for Forbes called Michael Del Castillo on how this is done in the food industry. You know, you can track the meat from the cow where it was that was raised on the ranch to where it was processed to how it was shipped and where it was stored, so that if there's some kind of disease outbreak, you can really promptly see what happened with the food and where it's gone. With a wider circle of participants than you would if it was a consortium or coalition. There's sort of a concentric circles of cooperation where first you have the firm. Everybody shares data within the firm because it's your job. If you're all getting along well, an industry might have a consortium that agrees on data standards and uses it. Blockchain takes it to a further level of breadth, and that you can have participants who are not associated with one another terribly closely, but they all participate in this open data project and create sort of an open resource of data about a certain subject matter. The full-blown cooperation process is a cryptocurrency secured blockchain project. So +1 to the blockchain being a good and real thing. I'd love to, though, just make a couple comments on something that each of the speakers said to maybe elicit some discussion. And I thought Professor Mcginnis's talk was characteristically excellent because we agree on pretty much everything. Unfortunately, he said you don't need to trust in a political process in the cryptocurrency world, and that's true vis-a-vis governmental political processes. But if you spend much time under the hood in the Bitcoin community and other cryptocurrency communities, you find that there are intense political processes. They just happen to be non-coercive economic and social power exercises rather than a coercive governmental exercise. So the politics in Bitcoin is really awful, actually. It's as if you took the Federal Reserve, which from the outside looks really austere and sedate, and you turned it inside out and saw how viciously all the members of the Open Market Committee fought with one another. That's what Bitcoin is. It's sort of a wide open political process, unfortunately. Mary Beth, also with a great presentation and very informative because she's working in the real world on this stuff, suggested that price fluctuation, volatility, which is a real problem, is maybe one of the primary impediments to adoption. I think, and we should talk about, usability. Just user interface for most systems is pretty darn bad. It's hard for a person who's interested to go, you gotta study for hours. You gotta study for months to actually be a smart cryptocurrency user. And so there's a lot of work that could be done on user interface for Bitcoin and the other major currencies. Okay, you've drawn me out, Professor Marchant, whose name should be pronounced with an excessive French accent.
Very controversial issue.
You know, I don't know, I think you're making the use a lot harder than it is, and I don't know why anyone would ever write down that long string of numbers. I mean, because
Clearly didn't know
there,
what I was doing.
there are so many wallets out there today, commercial wallets, you know, in addition to, of course, the most secure company on the planet, Kraken, that you could use, which we've never been hacked before. So if anyone wants a, you know, secure place to put your crypto, it's Kraken. But to be able to use, you know, cryptocurrency, if you have it in a wallet already, you know, you like take a picture of it on your phone and then you like move it to another wallet or, you know, wherever you're spending it. So you don't have to, you know, write the numbers down. It really is actually pretty easy. It's almost like Venmo. So if people could learn how to use Venmo, you could learn how to spend cryptocurrency. And I think it's important that we do make a distinction here. We've been talking generically about Bitcoin, but Bitcoin is by no means the only cryptocurrency. There are more than 3,000, probably 4,000 cryptocurrencies, and they're all different. Now, Bitcoin was, you know, the first, and so that's why everyone knows about it, and it's the most accepted. It's the one that is largest, you know, in circulation. Market cap, right, that's the word, thank you. And so that is the one that we talk about. And yes, it does use a lot of energy to mine it, but there are other cryptocurrencies that are not as expensive to mine, like Ethereum, and some cryptocurrencies aren't even mined at all. Some of them are just created. And some cryptocurrencies are created to do all sorts of amazing things, like provide extra computing space. So instead of going out and having to buy, 20 computers when you only need 20 computers once a month, you can buy these coins so that you have the extra capacity computing space when you need it. So there are some really cool things that cryptocurrency can be used for. So it's not all just, Bitcoin. It's a lot of different things, a lot of different projects that have been created with this new technology.
So Mary Beth has actually created another area for disagreement because
As I normally do.
It is a lesson that people should not have to learn themselves, that you don't actually own your Bitcoin unless you control the private keys. If you keep your Bitcoin with Coinbase or with Kraken or with any other wallet service provider, if you like, you don't actually control that Bitcoin. They will probably do what you want with the Bitcoin. They will probably let you have it when you call for it, but they don't always do that. And they're susceptible to the censorship and surveillance risks that people are trying to avoid by using Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies. I wanted to confess my own story of losing Bitcoin. I bought Bitcoin in 2011 at a price of about $10. And it was promptly hacked off of the exchange where I had purchased it. And so it was gone. And according to my purchase plan at the time, which was a sensible small portion of my overall investment portfolio, I would have had something like $20 million worth of Bitcoin last December. So make sure to move your Bitcoins off of your service provider and control your own private keys, or else you don't actually own your Bitcoin. So a person who works at Kraken has good reason to be confident in Kraken and think well of it, but this is about your financial independence, not a new boss to rely on the way we've relied on the banks of old. The one last thing I think we could talk about more is the energy expenditure involved in Bitcoin. I think that's a real subject, and it's a real concern. But there's a lot more to be learned about it. One is that Bitcoin is actually oversecured right now. There's an excess of mining, more money being spent on mining than Bitcoin needs, and thus more energy being consumed by Bitcoin than Bitcoin actually needs. There's some future where there's an equilibrium price that everyone's sure is going to be about the price of it versus other things for all eternity, and you'll see spending on mining come down and thus energy consumption come down. But also, the consumption of Bitcoin, of energy for Bitcoin and other mined cryptocurrencies. I should say, when I say Bitcoin, I'm usually meaning sort of just cryptocurrencies generally, at least proof-of-work style the energy consumption for mining goes where energy is cheapest. And right now that's Chinese hydropower. It's in the northwest of the United States. It's in Greenland. So it's not taking energy that you would be using here in Arizona and driving up your price of air conditioning. It's putting a floor underneath what is largely renewable energy generation right now. So there's more to say about Bitcoin than just that it's consuming as much energy as a given country, because energy is actually very localized on the planet, and Bitcoin mining goes where the energy is. So
I want to just respond to Mr. Harper's comment about, well, there's a lot of politics in Bitcoin. Well, that's surely right, but it's politics constrained by markets in a way that the Fed is really not constrained by markets. If they do some bad things, people are not going to use Bitcoin. Indeed, there are occasional, we may have a chance to talk about forks in Bitcoin. People go on and do their own thing. I actually don't, some people think that's a real worry. I think actually it's good in the sense that that actually is more likely to lead to the optimization of the currencies. But I think that's an important difference. You, of course, are going to have politics. You have corporate politics in corporations, but we think that's not as much of a worry because the corporate politics are constrained by the markets that corporations are in. With respect to Gary Martin's concerns, I associate myself with the comments about energy. I'd like to make a sort of more global point, which is, of course, we're thinking about cryptocurrency in its really initial stages. Though, assuming we have a continuation of progress in Moore's Law or the subsequent successors to Moore's Law, greater computation power, better software, I think we're likely to have more effective cryptocurrencies, or Bitcoin will use some of those to become more effective. And it's important also to understand that we don't have to imagine one cryptocurrency. My, at least, imagination is we would be in a world with a lot of different cryptocurrencies that, again, would be optimized for different uses. One of the advantages, perhaps, of Bitcoin will be that it is so, has so many people mining it, it has so much decentralization that people have an enormous kind of confidence in its value, and that they'll use for long-term holdings, but they may use other kinds of currencies for more short-term use and not use the greater cost of Bitcoin. It's a sort of a world, I might imagine, I would analogize it to kind of the Lord of the Rings. There'll be a lot of different rings, but Bitcoin may be the one ring that rules them all. The final point I'd make is I'm very enthusiastic about blockchain in general, but I do think we want to make an important distinction between permissioned blockchains and permissionless blockchains. There are some blockchains that are extremely useful, but you require permission to use them. And that, of course, raises some of the same questions about trust in general. Who's going to be able to use these? If we're going to have a trustless blockchain, and I don't say that that's the only use for it, there needs to be something that's going to reward the people who are going to keep the ledgers, and that's where some form of cryptocurrency or token comes in. And again, I think it could be quite different from Bitcoin. Indeed, at the moment, one thing we haven't discussed is there are an enormous number of what are called ICOs, initial coin offerings, in which people finance a new kind of activity through giving coins. I don't want to go into that at great length, but I think that's very promising. It's just not a way to raise money. It's a way of creating platforms and aligning the interests of the users of platforms better with their creators by creating a coin offering rather than just selling stock. So there are a lot of uses. I absolutely agree with that. I think many of them do come back with some mechanism of value, at least if it's not going to be a permissioned blockchain.
And I think it's a very important point, and whenever you talk with people from the cryptocurrency or blockchain communities, this becomes a controversial issue because the initial model was, as John laid it out, basically a political model of libertarianism, of escape from government, of basically just allowing this governmentless system to operate on its own. And if you go to these other models, from proof of work with the miners to these other models, like the permission ones are proof of value, where basically you might randomly assign with a random number generator to people who have the most value invested in the blockchain, in the cryptocurrency. Or even worse, maybe proof of authority, where some central entity is identifying who we trust. That's what Microsoft's now developing, a proof of authority blockchain. You go away from that whole libertarian, permissionless model. And so there's always people in this community who are very reluctant to see that happen. But the reality is that that's where the vast majority of blockchain applications are going. I'll give you an example. I was at a global legal blockchain consortium meeting last summer, and a partner from a major national law firm, Oric, is talking about how they have a group of 6 companies who are working on this big project together. They each have their separate law firm. They have an agreement that's been revised numerous times. These big companies have many different departments who are operating off of that agreement. It turns out everyone's operating off of different versions. It's just a crazy mess. And so what they did is they created a private blockchain where every version is on there. Everyone who is in the law firms and the companies gets access to it. Nobody else does, so it's permissioned. And you can now always go and always see the most current version. And there's no excuse now to use an old version because it was in your files. And she said it's literally saved them millions of dollars. So this is not just a ledger, because each entity has a copy of the distributed ledger. So it is a blockchain, but it's nothing like the cryptocurrency permissionless ones, because it's only these 6 law firms and these 6 companies that have access to it, and everybody within them. But it's incredibly valuable.
Google Docs already do that?
There's questions of security. There's questions of being able to see when anyone comes into that and have a record of it. There's a number of benefits of that they found that this was a model that was working for them. And let me just say one other thing, too, on the operability. This is an early technology. I remember, when I was a lawyer, a young associate, going down to our law library to ask them to find me a document on something called Gopher, or they went to the University of Minnesota or something. There was no World Wide Web where you could type in Amazon or Kraken or something and find whoever you wanted yourself. You needed some expert to figure out just how to, transfer through this system to find things. It was a great innovation, but it was completely almost unusable. And so this technology is going through that same learning curve, and it will get more user-friendly over time, I'm sure.
Mary Beth, can I ask you, you talked a little bit about regulation and regulatory schemes in other countries. I'm wondering if you could give some examples of what does that regulation look like, or what are they regulating, and just to kind of elaborate on that point a little bit.
Yeah, I would say that, the 3 that are out there right now are Japan, Singapore, and Abu Dhabi. And in each of those countries have a monetary authority that cover various types of financial institutions. And they have different sectors depending upon what the financial service would be. So if it's, capital markets, then there are certain requirements that the company has to meet, if you're going to interact with, individuals on a retail basis or companies. And then there's like a separate system if you're going to operate an exchange as we do, and you're going to, trade the cryptocurrencies. And then there's maybe a separate track if you are going to just offer to sell cryptocurrencies and you're not trading. So they will essentially go through every aspect of action that could be taken and introduce rules. And it's all done within one framework. And this is very different from what we have in the US because of the fact, again, that we have different regulators. And if you take, for example, any type of cryptocurrency, if it is what the CFTC would call a spot trade, a trade that is, just a single trade made within 30 days. There's no registration required. The Commodities Exchange Act doesn't even apply, so there's no regulation. But if you were going to try to make this trade for longer than 30 days, then it would be a future, be a derivative product, and then there would have to be a registration that would be required. If the product is deemed to be a security by the SEC, then that particular product would have to be registered with the SEC before it could be sold. Right now in the U.S., none of the cryptocurrencies that we have on the market are registered with the SEC. In 2017, we had so much going on with regard to what Professor Mcginnis said as ICOs. And some of them, I think, that came out in the beginning of the year were really legitimate projects where companies were creating something. They were creating a system that was going to work to produce something, and they were creating a token that was going to work in that system. And some of them actually had the system that was already working at the time they sold the token, and those would not have been securities. And the more these ICOs were introduced into the market, the more people tried to get them into the market faster and faster. And then you saw these coins being sold long before the systems were ever built. And it got to the point where people were trying to have ICOs when they didn't even know what their idea was going to be. And that's the point at which the SEC stepped in and said, whoa, wait a minute, enough.
Something like $10 million for Doggy Coin or something?
Oh, they were huge. There were hundreds of millions of dollars that were raised in the ICOs by individuals who were promising all sorts of crazy things for something that wasn't, not only didn't it work, it wasn't built, there wasn't even a concept. And so the SEC really put the brakes on this and reminded the community that the Howey test is still alive and well, and that you had to try to take that test and apply it to the modern day. And it can be done, and I think that everyone step back and realize that you cannot market a coin if it is not working in a system, at least having some functionality. And so that's probably one of the reasons that we saw somewhat of a cooling in the cryptocurrency market. But I think as people realize that they've got to create the product first before they sell it, we're going to see the market pick back up again.
So there's a whole other swath of regulation that I think is worth talking about, which is, I would characterize as anti-privacy regulation, that exchanges and any company dealing in cryptocurrency in the U.S. and most places in the world has to comply with. In the U.S., it's the Bank Secrecy Act, Orwellian named law that requires financial institutions to collect information about their customers for the possible use of the government, including suspicious activity reports and currency transaction reports regarding any transfer of value worth $10,000 or more. Part of the vision of the cryptocurrency, the Bitcoin community, at least in the early days, was to get out from under that for libertarian and privacy reasons, but also because the extraordinary expense that the financial services industry goes to comply with these regulations. They almost certainly fail as a security or law enforcement measure on a simple cost-benefit analysis, because billions and billions of dollars are spent worldwide. And also, to comply with these regulations, a lot of financial services providers exclude business lines. We heard about that a little bit this morning. Operation Choke Point was a sort of example of that kind of thing. But also entire countries and regions of the world get less access to financial services through the traditional system because they're regarded as areas of concern. Entire countries have been cut off by financial services providers. That's not good counterterrorism. That's not good national security, because it perpetuates poverty and other kinds of things where threats to our national security can brew. But with respect to your individual privacy, you don't have any if you're dealing with a financial services provider. They're collecting information about you, and they're prepared to hand it over to the government. The authority that the National Security Agency relied on when it was defending its now canceled program to collect information about all of our telephone calls, was authority based on challenges to the Bank Secrecy Act in the early 1970s. It's financial surveillance that the Supreme Court validated at that time, and you can bet that the government is looking very carefully or has access to most all of our financial transactions without respect to the consequences under the Fourth Amendment. I've done a few filings with the Supreme Court to try to change that. Not successful yet, but I've got a couple justices who are saying the right things.
Us going to exchanges and asking for records of people buying and selling?
Yeah, they are. In fact, Coinbase had a very large request last year because the IRS looks at cryptocurrency as property. And so if you were one of the people like Mr. Harper here who bought it at $10 and then, you held it for a long time, and when it went up to almost 20,000 and you decided to move it off the exchange into a wallet, the IRS would then send a subpoena to the exchange and ask, for information so that they could tax you on your property.
Why don't we take some questions? Do we have over here, maybe?
Hello, my name is Matthew. I'm from Northwestern, and I wanted to hear from panelists who've heard about the possible benefits of currency, but also some of the risks. One of the or disadvantages being the only 10 transactions per second with Ethereum, as compared to traditional currencies, which can process millions of transactions per second. Do you think that if you had to go 20 years in the future and imagine what the best case role for these cryptocurrencies are, what do you think that would be? Do you think that there's still a role that traditional currencies do better than cryptocurrency could ever do? Or could there be a world where they completely replace our current monetary system?
I slightly disagree with the characterization that it's 10 transactions a second, because on almost all the exchanges, the transactions are batched, and so you have a whole bunch of transactions that all move on the blockchain at the same time. So that transaction might have, hundreds of transactions in it. So I'm not sure what the actual number of transactions that's moving every, so many seconds.
It's pretty limited, though, compared to MasterCard or Visa. I mean, whether it will always be that's, I think, the nature of the question is, how do we see this scaling up? And I think there's a lot of recognition that if this is going to be, John talked about different things that money can do. It can be a store of value that's different, where you don't have to worry about the transaction cost so much. So that could be one benefit of these. But if we want to make it, that you use it to buy your cup of coffee, you don't want to pay $10 transaction costs or wait, 15 minutes. So the question is, can we scale it up so that this could be used in that kind of way? And I don't know the answer to that, except there's a lot of people who want to do that.
Is actually the locus of one of the most intense political debates in the Bitcoin community. There was a fork to something called Bitcoin Cash because Bitcoin Core, as it's been called, maintains a limit on the size of blocks and thus on the number of transactions that you can go through. So Bitcoin Cash and variants that have sprung up since then have little or no restriction other than market forces, that is the cost of mining, to limit the number of transactions. So you can have a coin that has a huge number of transactions. For the Bitcoin Foundation, I did a study of actually what outcomes we were seeking. This is back in the day, and it was just the leadership of the foundation. But the number one, I asked an unprompted question. Everyone I asked cited global financial inclusion as an outcome that they wanted to see from Bitcoin. So half the world's people don't have access to formal financial services. And when you don't have access to formal financial services, it makes it very hard to save. I found a study, I like the number, but it's only one study, so take it for what take it as just one study. It said that people without formal financial services lose on average 26% of their savings per year. I think that means that once every 4 years, they're cleaned out. Fire, flood, banditry, husband going into town and drinking all the savings away, whatever it may be. It's very hard to save if you don't have access to financial services. So getting people into a financial services system is a great thing to do. Do we need to string HSBC Bank out into the middle of Rwanda? No. Let's use satellite internet communications to get people the capability of going to market and returning to their village without obviously having access to any funds. You can sort of abscond with your own funds by keeping a mnemonic in your head or carving your private key on the inside of your Frisbee or whatever the case may be. Anyway, global financial inclusion was a huge goal of the community when I was investigating it.
Well, as I said, I'm quite optimistic about the technology, and Mr. Harper suggests, I think one of the reasons, we could have, I think, scale things up even now, and I imagine with better technology, we'll be better at scaling things up. There are trade-offs, and Bitcoin Cash is more centralized than the miners, and again, this, I think, is a suggestion that what we would observe if cryptocurrencies do become sort of the worldwide core of currencies, we'd observe a lot of different currencies that are specially purposed. So I'm really bullish on the technology. What I'm more worried about is, I guess, the empire strikes back, right? It's the government. This will take real control of currencies, if these were to be successful, away from governments. And governments use currency for all these, and I'll put it in quotes, public regarding ideas, right, for improving unemployment, a variety of matters. And at the moment, they could try to, themselves spend enough money to make a 51% attack. Now, and to say if I'm just some paranoid about this, let's go back in American history. The gold clauses were struck down, were invalidated by the government. This was a way of creating essentially a mechanism of payment that was outside of the central currency. And not surprising, in the progressive New Deal era, people weren't very enthusiastic about that kind of private action, and the government struck it. Now, this is going to be harder because, of course, it will take a lot of money to make a 51% attack. And so one question I have is this going to be the optimistic view of cryptocurrencies is kind of boiling the frog idea, right? That the cryptocurrencies are going to be successful, they're just going to get more and more successful, and by the time governments realize they're a real competitor, they're really going to have a great deal of trouble squelching them, both where it will cost a lot of money. It'll be sort of like Uber in the sense that so many people will be using them, there'll be a big constituency for them. But I think that's, to me, the big question mark for the success of cryptocurrencies. And I think we see, even in American history, the desire for the state to control money, and cryptocurrencies are just a direct attack on that fundamental idea of state sovereignty.
Over here.
Thank you all for coming. I thought the panel was fantastic. Ms. Buchanan, I've been a Kraken customer since I started. I've been an active trader since 2013. I've made money, I've lost money. I'm in the black on that. I'm not a millionaire, or I would have sponsored the conference, but but
Still hope yet.
I'm just hoping that Russians and Robert Mueller aren't chasing me right now. But I want to turn to sort of the regulation question, because I did the trading down on the peer-to-peer level, and then the money transfer service licenses got in the way with the excessive cost, et cetera. And then you have this evolving players in the industry. So the way I see it is there are sort of three general levels that sort of blur in terms of the industry. There are the institutional investors, there's the average user, and then there's the relatively sophisticated user. The two former categories need regulation, but the people who are down at the sophisticated level, like myself, don't want regulation, they don't need regulation, they have learned how to protect themselves in a lot of ways. So in terms of towards a model of going forward, I'd be interested in hearing what you think is appropriate regulation, not as a per se rule in essence, but as a leveled rule. And just if I could throw out my own thoughts on that, I don't think cryptocurrency should be regulated in its purest form in the sense of the commodity for lack of, or the token for lack of a better word, but the exchanges should be held accountable through the tort law for the hacks, et cetera, and institutional investors who are going to offer the ETFs and stuff need to be regulated because the average consumer is going to get killed out there. So I would just be interested, because as Professor Mcginnis pointed out, a lot of Bitcoin growth or any cryptocurrency growth is going to be based on trust. But if you over-regulate it, it's going to lose its utility and then its value. So I'd be interested in hearing your opinions on that.
Are you my CEO's brother?
I could probably pass for him, but I think you can hear I've been doing this for a while, so I basically am probably the closest representative you might get from the underground world right here.
Well, these are some really excellent points that you raise, and these are issues that we face every day, and we are continuously meeting with regulators from the U.S. and from around the world that want to talk to us and learn about cryptocurrency. So we've done so many educational meetings and so many meetings to discuss, how our platform works, because every platform does not work the same. And many of the regulators right now are really interested in talking about market manipulation. And so one of the first questions is, okay, well, what do you mean by market manipulation? Can you describe that? And the problem is most of them really can't. They don't know what it is that they're looking for. And unlike the stock market where you have stocks that are traded on, one or maybe two exchanges, cryptocurrency, is traded on, 100 or 200 exchanges. So it's really not possible, to manipulate the market. So, we do have certain things that we do to try to keep the market fair and open for all participants. And we do that by having the book is available for everyone to see, so you can see, what the trading is at any given time. We are available for regulators to request information, from time to time, and we, make that information available. I really can't think of a regulation that I would propose. And I think that, the United States really has to think about the fact that there are only, I think, 3 U.S. exchanges left. So you've got Circle, Kraken, and Coinbase, and all the others are outside of the U.S. And
There used to be like 100 here, right?
well, not quite 100, but there were quite a few. And our biggest market is not in the U.S., but probably 80% of our regulatory costs are in the U.S.
So it's not just the regulation, it's also the uncertainty about the regulation is the other burden, that actors don't really know what standards they're going to be held to. So it's very hard to act with that uncertainty over you, right?
That's right.
One point I just make generally, which is that I think it's very important in thinking about regulation generally and regulation of cryptocurrency, not to think that the government should have kind of specialized regulations for this, but as you pointed out, there may be tort laws, the general tort law. That's important because otherwise this becomes driven by ignorance, driven by interest group politics. The great advantage of general rules and neutral principles, something, of course, the society champions, is that they're likely to give a kind of stability, and they're also likely to make sure that cryptocurrency isn't being singled out for some sort of unfair regulatory burden. So I think we really have to think about it under the general principles of either securities law on the general principles of tort law and try to make kind of the best, fairest analogies. I know that's very general, but I think that's extremely important for the success of Bitcoin, because that's going to give success of cryptocurrency, because that's going to give people the kind of confidence that cryptocurrencies aren't being singled out or indeed given favorable treatment. That's the way forward on regulation.
I actually thought of one. Asset reserves. We do not hold fractured reserves, so we hold full reserves. So all of the money that you put in our exchange is held. So your money is your money all the time.
Hi. My question is involving the use of cryptocurrency to circumvent individual or targeted sanctions on individuals such as terrorist organizations or cartels. Mr. Harper, you briefly touched on how sanctions as a whole on a state have some negative consequences, and I do generally agree with that. However, America has had some success in targeted sanctions in cutting off the legs of these cartels or terrorist organizations. And my understanding of cryptocurrency is that it's relatively anonymous, and that's why a lot of users like it. Please correct me if I'm wrong. I don't have a very technological understanding. So my question to the panel is, do you see this as a major issue that could arise, and is there a need for regulation because of that?
It's a curious issue, and I appreciate you bringing it up. For those who don't know, there's under U.S. law, there's an office in the Treasury Department called the Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC, and they, for years, have issued a list of people with whom Americans and financial partners of the United States may not do business. So, financial sanctions on Iran or specific persons in Iran are implemented through OFAC. Russian leaders who've gotten on the wrong side of us, et cetera, et cetera. OFAC, and that program's been in place for a long time. It's used names. It's used names of people and organizations to identify who you may not do business with. Well, Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies are at least pseudonymous, and trading happens with these long strings of characters, whether you write them on a piece of paper or not. And if, in essence, you can't have an OFAC list with respect to wallet addresses, because you can create a wallet address anytime you want just using some math, and you can create a program to create a wallet without asking anyone's permission. So, so that program and that source of power for the U.S. government could be quite weakened if cryptocurrency were to take off and there were to be substantial trading in crypto. You can, by substantial, I mean, there's substantial now in billions, but we're talking, trillions of potential value exchanged on crypto. It is somewhat anonymous. I like the way you put that, because there's a lot of capacity to do tracking of cryptocurrency as it flows through the blockchain, and no one knows exactly how the future will come out, but it could well be that that if everybody starts controlling their private keys, hint, hint, you can still track the movement of assets from one entity to another, because you have enough that are reporting in that you can get a sense of financial flows, and you can see, though people will take measures to counteract this counter surveillance, you'll be able to see that money moved from New York City to Cali, Colombia, and you'll be able to see that money moved from Iran to Pakistan or whatever it may be. So the OFAC process is threatened by cryptocurrency, but I think it's a race that will continue to be able to track
Actually,
funds for national
there are
security
some
purposes.
pretty sophisticated measures that are in place. So with respect to exchanges, we have lists that we have to match against. So there are certain individuals, certain countries, that we cannot do business with. Whenever you use an exchange, you have to register the wallet address for which you will take money off the exchange. So we will research that address, and if that address, and only that address, that you can use to take money off the exchange. And the Treasury has gotten better at having lists of bad addresses. And so if there are addresses that are bad, those individuals we don't do business with. And there are systems in place that do track people that try to change addresses too frequently. And we are required to know, who the actual beneficial owner is, if it's a corporate account. So there are a lot of measures in place, and I think that the, exchanges do understand that cryptocurrency is used for bad purposes, just like cash is. But we do our part to make sure that they're not using our exchanges to commit criminal activity.
So I would say, at least currently, for reasons that were suggested, I'm not very concerned because it's pseudonymous rather than anonymous, and so it can be tracked. The Bank of England did a study saying that cash remains the best way of evading detection, even much better than cryptocurrencies. But just to make sure that I don't seem like completely Pollyannish, one, I think, consequence, at least of my vision or vision, that we're going to have optimized cryptocurrencies. There are some cryptocurrencies that are not pseudonymous, they're anonymous. Now, I think for a variety of reasons, they're not likely to be the most important kinds of cryptocurrencies, but they could be well-tailored for people who want to do very bad things. And so that actually is a concern of mine, not about Bitcoin, but about an anonymous cryptocurrency that is actually, you really cannot detect in the future. And I don't know exactly how to think about that.
Some of the strongest demand for fully private blockchains and fully private trading is from entirely legitimate industry. In financial services, you want to be able to do trades without giving away to the rest of the community who's doing what trades, right? If Merrill Lynch, I don't know enough about financial services to know that they provide these services. If Merrill Lynch were to put out there with every trade which customer of theirs was doing what trade, that would be a privacy abomination for the legitimate privacy interests of individuals, the legitimate confidentiality interests of companies. So there's a lot of demand in this area for entirely legitimate confidentiality and privacy. So we don't know how it comes out, but it's a lot of interesting balances to be struck.
Over here.
My name is Miranda. I'm in a blockchain and cryptocurrency class at BYU Law, so there are other classes like yours. I wonder about the 50+1 problem, where if more than 50% get together and say we're going to change the blockchain, then they can change the blockchain. So my question is, should these sorts of attacks be subject to antitrust laws? And if your answer is no, there's no need, because if this kind of 50+1 problem happens, then everyone will just get off the block or get off that cryptocurrency and move to another one, then based on what we said about anonymity, how can we know that's happening?
Well, I mean, one problem with using antitrust laws is if you watch Silicon Valley, they could be in China who's doing the 50+1 attack, right? And pretty much outside of our enforcement authority on antitrust. It could even be one entity, in a small enough cryptocurrency could, have half the mining power. You look on Bitcoin, they show you who wins each block. And you're seeing these same names come up over and over. There's like 3 names that are like 90% of the blocks right now are winning. There's been this huge consolidation from, I don't know how many there was initially, but it was like literally law students on their laptops to now these huge entities who have these huge technology, and they're getting fewer and fewer of them. And so they're not even having to collude, maybe because they're going to have so much power, each individual one. But again, I don't think the 50+1 attack is a problem with these major cryptocurrencies. And so you just need to be smart. But if you're on one of these little ones way down there, you're probably vulnerable, and you might want to be careful about that, assuming they have a mining as their model. They may have a different model.
So Mr. Harper specifically mentioned that there were financial aid issues. How have you seen international financial institutions such as the World Bank and the World Bank adapt to cryptocurrencies, and what steps do you see them taking in the near future?
I can't tell you anything about the World Bank's thinking on it. I've seen interesting things from the European Central Bank has done studies of cryptocurrency. I thought were pretty good, actually, relative to some of the work that was being done in the U.S. The Financial Action Task Force is a Paris-based offshoot of the OECD, if I'm not mistaken. FATF part of OECD or separate? Whatever the case. FATF sort of tries to drive the surveillance laws forward across the world, and I was privileged to be at 2 of their private sector consultations in Brussels over 2 years, and they were keenly interested in how to use the blockchain for surveillance. So that's what I know about some of the international institutions. You might know more.
It's a great idea. Actually, I spent some time at the UN, and I wish I'd known about cryptocurrency then, because I think if they had tried it in Haiti, maybe we'd be farther along with the reconstruction.
Great. Anything else? No? Gene?
I had one quick question. I thought the line was done, but actually 2 very quick questions. One, I wanted to give Mary Beth Buchanan a chance to respond to the comment about Kraken not being secure earlier that Jim Harper
No, I
made
said
about-
they are secure.
I'm sorry?
I said they are secure.
Yeah, he said they weren't, so that's what I was, or did I misunderstand you?
No, well, I tried to express the principle that's well established in the Bitcoin community. You don't own your Bitcoins unless you control the private key. Kraken, among other things, provides wallet services. That is, they hold your Bitcoin for you.
Right.
That creates risks. Whereas if you hold your Bitcoin private keys yourself, you don't have risks. I wasn't alleging that Kraken
Well,
is
if you hold them
insecure.
yourself, you have risk too, if you're having your computer hacked,
Yeah.
and
Well, I
losing
suppose
them.
that's true.
Sort of like holding money under your mattress. That is risks, right? I mean.
And the other thing was, when Bitcoin, I forget what the total amount of Bitcoin that could exist is, but when somebody loses Bitcoin, does that have any effect on the value of the Bitcoin that, you hold 100 Bitcoin? Does that increase, decrease, or be irrelevant to the value of the Bitcoin you hold?
You'd like people to lose their Bitcoin, right?
Yeah,
I think, right?
but what
If
effect does it
others,
have
you'd
on-
like to hold the Bitcoin, hope others lose it, your value would probably go up, I would think.
Yeah. There will only ever be 21 million Bitcoins according to the software everybody runs, and pretty much everybody agrees that that's the software they're going to be running. Obviously, other coins could do other things. So 21 million is the max, and we're going to reach that max over another 100 and something years, 116 years or something like that. There are people who measure the amount of total Bitcoin that's ever come into existence, and there are people who try to calculate the amount of Bitcoin that's been lost. And the people who try to calculate the amount of Bitcoin that's been lost, believe that we'll have a higher equilibrium price because there's lots of Bitcoin that's just gone. So it's more scarce because of
There's some
lost Bitcoin.
poor schmuck who was an early Bitcoin guy who had his computer thrown into a dump in London. He's digging up every landfill in London because he has millions and millions of dollars of Bitcoins on it. Those are lost. They're gone.
So just talking about security, and anyone who's in the cryptocurrency space knows at least 100 people who talk about the Bitcoin that they left on their laptop at their last employer, and it was back in 2011, and now it's gone. So the benefit of having it in an exchange wallet is that it's kept in cold storage so that it is not susceptible to hacking. So it is more secure, assuming, of course, that the exchange does follow your instruction and send it to your wallet. But with, reputable exchanges, particularly those in the U.S., you know where they are, you know where they're located. I don't think that there is the risk that you would have dealing with, some foreign exchange that you're not going to be able to reach.
I think Gene's question underscores an important point about the limitations, which of course gives people confidence in Bitcoin. It also, assuming we had a world in which Bitcoin became kind of the reserve currency, it would create a world of deflation as the productivity continued to go up, and therefore Bitcoin, dollars wouldn't go, it would always be going up in value, and people worry about a world of deflation. Some people worry about that as an issue of the money supply. So that's another caveat on the wonderful future of cryptocurrencies.
Well, great. With that, let's thank our panel again. It was great. Thank you.